Hello, I'm Andrew Gentile,
And I'm Ariana.
and you're listening to Behind the Flicks. This show is all about me sharing as many facts as I know about filmmaking and directors and behind the scenes info about movies and whatnot to Ariana, and you'll join us for the ride. Okay, so today we have a major treat. We have on the program George Stevens Jr., who is the founding director of the American Film Institute and worked on his father's film, A Place in the Sun, and we were able to interview him.
Yeah. Amongst many, 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 many other accolades, you ever get a moment and look up George Stevens Jr. We owe him so much, and you'll get a real kick out of all the work he's done.
He was such a wonderful interview, and we're so grateful to have him on the program. His A Place in the Sun has a 70th anniversary Blu-ray, and also look out for George Stevens Jr.'s book, My Place in the Sun, which is coming out early next year. So Ariana, can we get a review of this episode's film?
Oh yeah, A Place in the Sun. Don't be scared that it's 70 years old, guys. I mean, I will openly admit that I sometimes have a hard time watching old black and whites because of the pacing. Sometimes kind of slows me down and I have to kind of retrack my interest. This movie had no problems keeping my interest at all. And it's crazy because the pacing is, it's simple. It's kind of, I wouldn't call it slow though. It's just very intentional. And it's so captivating, the story of this guy who's basically just, humble beginnings, ends up going to work for his uncle's company and gets himself in quite the love triangle, with a night of passion with a coworker, and then a, very, passionate love affair that I don't even know how to explain it. I'm messing up this review right now because I'm just so wrapped up in how wonderful George Stevens Jr. was in this film. It just surprised me. It surprised me. I did not know the story was going to go. It's a bit of crime drama, some tragedy, some possible murder. And it's totally takes a direction I didn't quite expect it to. And just the acting was absolutely unbelievable. I'd give this one an A.
Yeah.
Just because the fact that it is 70 years old and it is just as riveting and alive as ever, it totally, totally deserves the grade.
I was thinking about this. I feel like if I were to explain the plot to somebody,
Yes, help me out.
no. What I'm trying to say is, if I were to explain the plot to somebody, I think I'd screw it up, because if I were to say it out loud, people would say, "Oh, so it's like CSI or Law and Order." But then I realized, oh wait, they probably got that from A Place in the Sun, probably. I mean, maybe not directly, but it feels like crime dramas, have been influenced by A Place in the Sun, which have then further influenced television. So,
Yeah.
but what elevates this movie, in my opinion, above just a standard crime drama is the acting, the music, the cinematography, the directing.
Yeah.
It totally elevates what could be potentially, if handled incorrectly, standard crime drama and love story, albeit a twisted love story. It works so beautifully, like a Swiss watch.
Yeah. Yeah, it takes you on the journey, and it's not gratuitous in any way for any
No.
level of the film. It just feels so natural. The whole crime, when I first read, little things that we've exchanged, and you mentioned that it was a crime drama, I remember starting to watch this film and not knowing what you were talking about. Like, how does this turn into a crime drama? It really feels like a love story of this old guy, and then just the journey it goes on is so purposeful and wonderful, and it's very fun to watch it all unfold. It's directed so well.
Absolutely. The George Stevens, who was the father of our interviewee.
Yes.
I noted we all noted in the interview. He's just a magnificent actor's director.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, most definitely. It shows the acting in this is displayed extraordinarily well.
Uh, what was your favorite performance in the film, Ariana?
Oh man.
I know
I'm
mine.
well, it's hard not to say Montgomery Clift because
Same. Yeah.
it's just so wonderful what he does with this character, and it's amazing how he can be so soft-spoken and strong at the same time. You know, you don't get a sense that he lacks confidence at all, but there are times where you're not really sure how he views himself. And it's in a good way. It kind of shows a lot about his character and where he's at in life and what he's doing. And his performance is just so wonderful. And I love the way that he bonds with Elizabeth Taylor's character. I mean, in the film, there's might be a perception that they fall in love a little quickly, but it doesn't feel like a surprise. It all feels very organic the way it was intended to, and I just love it. I love what he did with his character. You do sympathize with him the whole time. When you said that, I was like, you're so right.
And I think the reason I empathize with Montgomery Clift's character is because from the beginning of the film, you know something is off with this guy.
Yeah.
Just with his mannerisms, just the way he talks and the way he moves, you know something is off with this guy. Like he's not quite like he's clearly lived a hard life, you know.
Yeah.
And that in Montgomery Clift's performance, on top of the screenplay, on top of the music, on top of the sound, and on top of the cinematography, on top of all these elements, it adds layers to his character. It adds like a whole like in screenwriting and in acting and basically all the arts. They say, there's more, like there's the tip of the iceberg, and then there's the iceberg below.
Yeah.
The water, you know.
Yeah.
And that shows in his performance.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Yeah. And that's what I think when I mentioned like it not being gratuitous.
Yeah.
The whole iceberg theory is so true because you really only, get to in the writing is really the tip. The story is just the tip. The performance is just so much underneath of it. I mean, for an actor to go into a film like this with a script like this, like yes, there's a lot to work with, but also so much of it just has to be expressed in his character and his mannerisms, like you said. Yeah. And holy cow, does he do a good job.
Yeah. What did you leave the film with? Like what did you take from the film?
Whew. I think I took from the film how simple you can be and still express the truth. You don't have to. I don't know. I've found that sometimes when you're in a scene or you find, a good chunk of dialogue, you feel like I gotta attach this movement here. Oh, it makes sense. Oh, they're feeling angry here. I should do something about that. Or, you kind of, I don't know, you kind of almost want to attach to the words a little bit and let them give you cues. And something I've taken from this film and the way that Montgomery Clift played this role is just looking for less of something to attach yourself to and let whatever's happening in the scene kind of reflect on you in the performance. Don't try to feed too much into it. You don't have to. And the directing style does that a lot too. The way it expresses, when he's coming through that archway from way behind, he gets small and he gets bigger as he enters the party room. Yeah. It's kind of like his introductory to this society, but also kind of, I'm sure it's a bit of how he feels too. And it just, there's so much little things you can do in a film to express the truth. You don't have to be crazy about it. What about you?
What?
What about you?
What I take away from the film?
Yeah, I want to know Andrew's answer.
What I took away from the film, it's gosh, that's a good question that I didn't even think was going to be thrown back at me. Yeah. What I take away from the movie is, honestly, it was Montgomery Clift's performance. That's what I took away. One of my favorite movies is called The Master, and it's by my favorite filmmaker, Paul Thomas Anderson. it has one of the great performances by Joaquin Phoenix, who plays a veteran suffering from PTSD, and I feel like Montgomery Clift's performance is kind of a precursor to that kind of naturalistic and traumatized kind of character.
Yeah.
And so, and I personally love when films are daring enough, when art is daring enough to kind of explore darkness.
Yeah.
That's what I kind of believe one of the purposes of art
Yeah.
is to explore subjects that we don't want to explore. It was daring in the 50s to cover subjects like abortion and sex out of wedlock, and you wouldn't think that this would be a good time at the movies, but it's a time. It's so compelling.
Yeah.
The film is so compelling that you can't help but be in awe of the craftsmanship.
Yes. Yes.
And
Compelling, it was definitely a word I'd attach to the movie.
now let's go to our interview with George Stevens Jr. So before we talk about your upcoming book and A Place in the Sun, I'd like to talk about one of your previous works. I read your book, Conversations with the Great Movie Makers of Hollywood's Golden Age at the American Film Institute. It can be found on Amazon, by the way. I gotta say, Mr. Stevens, I really love the book, and I feel like it should be a standard text in film schools. Reading about different filmmakers' varying perspectives on the craft of cinema is so fascinating and provides invaluable insights for all cinephiles. So thank you so much for writing it and conducting the interviews.
It's interesting. A prominent director, a young director, who came to the AFI to do a seminar a few years ago, and he was going along, and he reached down, he picked up this book. He says, "Everything that you need to know about filmmaking is in the Golden Age book."
Aw.
Yeah, good. And
Um,
I'll sign it.
oh,
Yeah.
that
Little
would be
virtual
wonderful.
signature.
So my first question is, which filmmaker from that book did you find yourself agreeing with the most in terms of their filmmaking philosophy?
Well, I guess we probably ought to start with George Stevens, Sr.
Oh yeah.
But well, several of them. Uh, you know, David Lean. I just love the way David Lean thinks about movies, and he's got such a powerful sense of storytelling, and he's so specific in his films. So David Lean would get my vote.
How did the insights provided by these filmmakers in your book influence your own work?
Well, I think I was influenced them before I did the book. Um, and there just so many things you pick up, and they come to you at different times. Billy Wilder saying, "Don't give me facts, give me emotion." That's something that I said to my colleagues in years we were producing the Kennedy Center Honors, and this basically it's the smaller observations, and they they are my companions.
Could you go a little bit more into detail about smaller observations? What do you mean?
I'm trying to think of William Wyler. Um, I just at the moment, the specific doesn't come to mind.
Right.
But, when you're in the editing room or you're trying to solve a problem, they come to you.
Yeah.
Right. So like happy accidents, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
I know what you mean. I mean, I think we see it when we're watching almost any kind of film. These little moments we find that help tell the story without being super direct or showing facts, like you said. It's just kind of a display of connection between what's going on, and it could be so small. It could be a line, it could be the way something looks, the way an actor looks at another actor, the way something visually is represented as somebody comes into a scene. I mean, there's so many little things that directors can do to help you build these little moments that all of a sudden you're like, I felt that little moment there. And you're totally right that it is about those. I feel like any film I've ever watched that really hits me, it always happens in that few seconds where the story kind of comes together.
Well, the Fellini seminar in that book, um, Andrew, I tell a story which is a very specific one of what was in the first couple of years of the AFI Conservatory. And, we had, young people, not all, some of them not that young, but they come with a bit of rebelliousness or want to carve their own path. And something that was very much they loved to talk about was improvisation. And when we would talk to them about writing a script, someone would say, I'm going to improvise that. So it just became a bit of a contention of we were teaching film structure with all kinds of flexibility, structure of all kinds of films, but that basically there is a structure to a film. And in the seminar, Fellini was there and Anthony Quinn was sitting on his right and I was sitting on his left. And they were asking questions and it was a huge event. And even Jack Lemmon and Billy Wilder called and said, can we come? So it was a wonderful group of about 80. And Fellini was insightful and charming. And then the question period came, and a fellow in the back, bearded fellow, stood up and he said, Mr. Fellini, I read a lot about the improvisation on your work. And I wonder if you could talk to us about, how you improvise in your films. And Fellini looked at Tony Quinn and he said, improvisatore? And Quinn nodded. And Fellini said, no, he says, for me, he says, making a movie is a very scientific process. For me, making a movie is like for you Americans sending people to the moon.
Yes. Yes.
And that sort of toned down for about a year the total absorption with improvisation at AFI.
Fantastic.
And of course, I would make the point that certainly there are moments when improvisation is useful, but as a foundation for making a film, the preparation is extremely important.
Yeah. And it leaves a lot of room for those improvised moments to actually work if it's planned. That way, when something organic happens in a scene, it's not random. It's kind of all still has the purpose because of all the preparation that went into it.
That's a good point, Arianna.
Yeah.
Something that you note in the book is that all the filmmakers interviewed at the time were men. In 1974, as you know, I'm just addressing the audience. In 1974, the American Film Institute started the Directing Workshop for Women.
Right.
I gotta say, I admire people, especially those with power and influence, who are able to say, this situation doesn't have to be like this, and then work to change that situation. How did the Directing Workshop for Women come to be?
It was shortly after we'd started the conservatory, which at first we called the Center for Advanced Film Studies, up at Greystone, the mansion in Beverly Hills. It was the home of the AFI program for the first 12 years. And we did not have many women fellows, as we call them. The first year we had none at all. And we were gradually getting more women fellows. But there was a very smart philanthropist, and she came to me with this idea, can't you do more for women directors? This was about 1974, 73. And so from that came the idea that we had the equipment, and so we started the Directing Workshop for Women. And one thing that enabled it was that video had just come along, and we had been making films in 35 millimeter at the conservatory. We continued to, but we started this video program, and it enabled the women filmmakers, the first 12 or 14 in the first class, they would make their films on video, and they would use the fellows at the center as cameramen and art directors, and so it really got them up to speed very quickly. And I was very pleased to read um, just last week that the Directors Guild elected Leslie Linka Glatter, who did so many of the Homeland and other wonderful um, films. She was the showrunner on Homeland. She's the new president of the Directors Guild, and it noted that she got her start uh, in the directing workshop for women,
Oh, wow. That's a beautiful legacy.
isn't it?
Oh, I love that. I love that. And when you were creating these, these wonderful institutions that help, further cinema, was that always kind of a part of your priorities, is trying to be as inclusive and kind of keep up with the times and continue to grow and stay relevant more, say? Was that always a part of your intention?
Uh, it was, but I would uh, be misleading you if I said that we got there very quickly.
Yeah.
It there were um, relatively few female applicants to the AFI in the first years,
Yeah.
and we were, I think, preoccupied with other things, and probably should have been encouraging, or later on we would, kind of systematically seek out and encourage it. It's, yes. Um, yeah, the basic answer is yes, Arianna.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that the intention to grow kind of obviously, evolved into inclusivity, because you can only grow so much if you keep your pool small. So
Yeah.
so that's really wonderful. You really set that up to, eventually get there, even if it wasn't there in the beginning, which I think is what it's about. You can't blame the times for being the times.
Well, Greystone had pretty lawns, and we had um, uh, and in the I think it was the first or second year of the conservatory and the directing workshop for women, uh, I was not getting a lot of praise then. It was controversial. The students were rebellious. They it was taxing. Let's put it that way. And one of the directing workshop for women participants left me a message and said she'd brought me a picnic. Would I meet her on the lawn? And I walked out, and there was Candy Bergen with a beautiful picnic. She was one of the in the first two classes of the directing workshop, so it had its rewards.
Yeah. Yeah, doing the right thing tends to do that.
Considering the fantastic writing quality in Conversations with the Great Movie Makers, I'm really excited to read your upcoming book. Can you please tell us a bit about it?
Sure. Um, it's a memoir, um, and it's ambitious. It's got 130 photographs. Um, it begins with my family. The book begins actually with my great grandmother. Her name was Georgia Woodthorpe, and she was born in San Francisco around the time of the Civil War, and she became an actress. She went to a little actors club when she was 8, and she read something, and one of the great actors of the era who ran his theater asked her family if she could come in his theater, and she became a star. And she is the youngest Ophelia to ever do Hamlet with America's greatest Hamlet, Edwin Booth, who happened to be the brother of John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated Abraham Lincoln. But Booth, the acting brother, actually, John Wilkes was also an actor, but not as a great one. But Booth, anyway, so our theater goes back, and actually she was the first that started 5 generations of Stevenses in show business. So I write about my family. My 2 grandparents, my father's parents were both actors in San Francisco. He ran his own theater. They traveled. My mother's mother was Alice Howell, one of the great comedians of the silent screen. And so I do talk about my family, and then I just trace my life. And the book is called My Place in the Sun, Life in the Golden Age of Hollywood and Washington.
Wow. Where and when can people find your book?
It's going to come out early next year. And I imagine they'll find it on Amazon, the way things work today, or at Book Soup, or Politics and Prose, or Doubleday. And certainly I'd be happy to come back and talk with you about it in more detail when early next year, if you're interested.
Oh, I can already say yes. We are interested very much.
And Andrew, knowing that you're a good reader, you will have read it by then, because the galleys will be coming out the end of this year, and I think it's at April publication date. But just to amplify a little bit, that I grew up in Hollywood. My father, of course, was one of the great directors.
Yeah.
And I worked with him, and we can talk more about that in the course of watching the films.
Yes.
And I also started directing Alfred Hitchcock Presents and Peter Gunn on television when I was 25. So it was sort of, I was following my father's path, and it did occur to me from time to time, though I wasn't too introspective, that it was likely that I could spend my entire life working to become the second best film director in my family.
Oh.
And then I worked with him, and by the time of The Diary of Anne Frank, I was his associate producer, and I directed all the location scenes in Amsterdam. And then a life-changing thing happened. Edward R. Murrow, who'd gone to work for President Kennedy, running the United States Information Agency, it came to Hollywood, and by a series of coincidences, we met. And he asked me to come back and run the motion picture division of the United States Information Agency, making documentary films during the Kennedy years. And it turned out to be just changed the direction of my life. I never lived full time in Hollywood after that, and it led to starting the American Film Institute and the Kennedy Center Honors and my other productions. So that's sort of that's the plot of the book.
Yeah, it sounds like you really had a moment where, you could have kept going down that path, like you said, and worked really hard to become the second best film director in your family. And then something shifted. You realized you can share value in a different way by, everything that you've created, which is amazing how much you've done for American films and preservation and honoring them and making sure we have access to them. And I've got so much respect for that. We owe you a lot of gratitude for that.
Yes.
My generation and future generations, there's a lot we have because of you.
Oh,
yes.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah. What was the shift? Why did that become so important to you to start holding on to these, films and honoring them, so expressively?
Well, there are roots in the answer to that question.
Yeah.
When the movie we're going to be talking about, A Place in the Sun, came out, I was about 18, I guess, and I went to the Academy Awards with my father.
Wow.
And my mother and my actress grandmother.
Yeah.
My father drove the car, which tells you a little bit how different things were then, or at least in our family. And I sat next to him and announced the nominees. It was John Huston for African Queen, William Wyler for The Desperate Hours, Vincent Minnelli for American in Paris. Wow. And I'm missing one. Elia Kazan for Streetcar Named Desire,
No.
and George Stevens for A Place in the Sun.
Wow.
Movies used to be something then, Arianna, or something. And Joseph L. Mankiewicz presented the award. He read out George Stevens, and my dad gave me a squeeze and went up to the stage and accepted his first Oscar. But driving home, with the Oscar was in the seat between us. My mother and grandmother were in the back seat, and I was perhaps a little excited. It was got a big night, and my father may have thought I was a little too excited. I remember he looked over at me and smiled. He said, we'll have a better idea of what kind of a film this is in about 25 years.
Wow.
And there were no Cinematheques or DVDs. I mean, people weren't going to see classic films. But he had this thing that the important thing about a movie was the test of time.
Yeah.
And he told me this. Now, how directly related that is to the idea that later I would start the American Film Institute or do the Kennedy Center Honors, I don't know. But it was just really that Murrow presented this opportunity, and I really weighed it. Do I really want to leave my career, which is develop my own picture, developing stories? And I climbed up to the top of the Washington Monument on a cold winter in February, a snowy day, and looked out toward the Potomac and said, like the little boy who throws his cap over the fence, I think I'll do it. And it turned out to be, the most nourishing and rewarding and productive experience I might have imagined. I don't think there was ever a time like that in Washington with this witty and smart president, and so many young people. I was 29 when I showed up for work, and there was so many other young people, Bill Moyers and Ted Sorensen and Dick Goodwin and the New Frontier, and then Murrow was one of the great figures in American life, and President Kennedy was just an extraordinary figure, and Jackie. So it was a great thing for me that I did it.
Oh, yeah. And we all benefited from it,
Yeah.
and continue to benefit from it. Now let's transition to A Place in the Sun. Before World War II...
That's a good transition.
I sure hope so. Before World War II, your father is noted as having directed movies like Swing Time, a Ginger Rogers Fred Astaire musical. After World War II, when he served in the military, he made movies like A Place in the Sun. Do you think his experiences in the war changed him?
They did, yes. I mean, he was away at war for 3 years. He saw one movie during those 3 years. He had it. General Eisenhower gave him the most important assignment of his life, which was to organize the photography for D-Day and on through the end of the war in Europe. And that he saw, he said, I saw saw people at their best and at their worst. I had a seat on the 50-yard line. And the most searing experience was his unit were the first people into Dachau. And he arrived there as a chronicler of the war. And that day he became a gatherer of evidence because uh, he and others anticipated that someday people would want to say that this never happened. And the footage that they shot at Dachau, he later made a film for the war crimes trials of the German leaders and the German generals. And with that and other concentration camp footage was shown. So yes, he came back, but he and before the war, he made the greatest comedies. The more the merrier. Alice Adams, which had humor, the Talk of the Town, Penny Serenade, just the brightest. And he had not lost his sense of humor when he came back. It's just that his agenda, he was supposed to make a comedy with Ingrid Bergman. He and Frank Capra and William Wyler had set up Liberty Films, first independent company of directors. And Capra made It's a Wonderful Life. And Ingrid Bergman wanted to do a picture with Dad, and they were working on a script. And he went back to see her and said, I'll work on the script on the train going east, and I'll fix it. And then he met her after the theater. She was in a play, and went to the 21 Club. And she says, they had ordered a drink, and she said, how's our little comedy coming? And he says, Ingrid, I'm sorry to tell you, there is no little comedy. He never told me why, but I think, it just felt awfully light for him to be doing coming back from the war. It's not that he wasn't as funny as he was. And he did, I remember Mama, which has some of the hilarious scenes, but it was about San Francisco and going back to his youth. So he was a different person. I should say before the war, Andrew, when he was, one of the reasons he left RKO is he wanted to make the book that Stanley Kubrick later made in Paris, The Generals with Kirk Douglas.
Passage to Glory.
Yeah. And he wanted to make that. And RKO didn't want to do it. So he had this period of theater and drama in the background. So it was not a total shift for him to make something like A Place in the Sun.
I see.
But that's a rather exhaustive answer to your precise question.
And it's a beautiful answer to my precise question.
Absolutely.
Do you feel as though that those experiences influenced his work that we see on the screen?
Yes, no question.
How so?
A rather lofty way of putting it was that he was concerned with the human condition.
Yeah.
And not in a totally lighthearted way.
Right.
And I can, and the Montgomery, and America, A Place in the Sun is based on Theodore Dreiser's famous novel of the era of the turn of the century, I believe, early 20th century, An American Tragedy. And he adopted it. And the young man became a World War II veteran. Not much is said about it, but he's got a leather jacket, and it's, and he's trying to find his way in the world.
Montgomery Clift's character.
The Montgomery Clift character. And then just the themes are deep.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So what was your role in the making of A Place in the Sun?
Well, let's say a minor role, huh? But
Okay.
but in terms of what we're talking about, um, worth mentioning. I had just graduated from high school, a Harvard school, which is now Harvard Westlake School in Los Angeles, and I was going on to Occidental College, which only became famous long after I'd left, when Barack Obama was revealed to have gone there. But it's a small college outside Los Angeles, in the environs of Los Angeles. And I didn't have anything to do that summer, so my father gave me two jobs. One was to take Theodore Dreiser's An American Tragedy and do albums, break down the whole story with every character, every situation, um, for him to use in the writing of the screenplay. Now, a slight deviation. The other was to read books and scripts that came from the studio to where we were working. We lived in the valley, and so most of these were for a 17-year-old, kind of tedious, sappy love stories. Nothing that was, and I wasn't a great intellect, but I did one afternoon see a little book, and I read it in the afternoon, and went over to see Dad that night, and he was in bed reading. And I walked in and said, God, I said, I've read this story. I think it's really a good story, and you ought to read it. And he kind of put down his paper and he looked at me. He said, why don't you tell me the story? And of course, I didn't think of it at the time, but I think he was letting me figure out whether I wanted to be in this racket and had any talent for it. So I then took a deep breath and I started pacing around his bed, telling him the story of Shane, Jack Schaefer's novel.
Wow.
So that was my summer of 1949, which was my introduction to A Place in the Sun.
Yeah.
And I remember during that summer, Montgomery Clift came by the house, and I remember meeting him. He had a car with a convertible with a torn top. And Monty was, in Los Angeles from the Actors Studio, sort of demonstrating his indifference to riches and fine things. But he was a spectacular looking, gifted man.
Yeah, he's really wonderful in this film. I mean, just unbelievable how well he takes you through the story without overworking. It's just so simple and intense at the same time. I loved it. It's completely captivating. It surprised me.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. It stands the test of time. I mean, he said, what kind of a picture this is going to be in 25 years? What if he'd said, what kind of a picture this is going to be in 70 years?
Yeah.
Right.
We know, and, it's one of those. I had to have this, just, I don't know if you've seen Mark Harris's biography of Mike Nichols. It's a fine book. And in it, in page early in the book, he talks about Mike he had, been wonderkind of the theater, the comedy in Chicago with Elaine May, then Elaine May on Broadway, then directing on Broadway. And suddenly he's going to make a movie called Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf?
Wow.
And with Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton.
Yeah.
And I heard him interviewed, and someone said, well, you've never been on a soundstage in a professional capacity. How did you prepare yourself to direct a movie with these big stars that I think it won the Academy Award, and he did. And he said, I watched A Place in the Sun 50 times. And in this book, it's worth noting that Nichols was now old enough to appreciate technique, and he was gripped by the filmmaking as he was by the story. It was Stevens' deeply considered visual and structural sense, his way of framing shots, of staging action, of positioning and directing his cast, and of letting scenes unfold slowly.
Yeah.
That kept Nichols coming back. Throughout his life, A Place in the Sun would be the movie he would mine for inspiration. It was his core text when he prepared to direct Taylor in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. And the length of each shot and the stillness of Stevens' camera strongly influenced his approach to The Graduate. It was also the font of instruction in which in later years he would send novice directors telling them, watch it 25 times. When you're done, let's talk. By his own count, he viewed the picture 150 times, many of them the year after it opened. It really got to me like nothing else had, he said.
Wow.
Filmmakers beget filmmakers. That's what I hear.
Isn't that,
that's
no.
fantastic. If I may go back to Montgomery Clift for just a moment.
Yes.
And you can absolutely correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like I've written a few scripts, and from my experience, I don't think, like, the way Montgomery Clift plays the role, I don't think that could have been written on the page. Like, the mannerisms, the tics, throughout the entirety of the film, I empathize with him, even as his character makes horrible decisions. How did your father and Montgomery Clift work together to craft his performance? I mean, am I wrong, by the way, about the script?
In this particular picture, I mean, Dad occasionally, would improvise to fix up a scene, certainly in his early comedies. But this script was very much a written script. Dad did some work on it during the film. The scene "Come to Mama" was a line that Dad put in. But Monty was a very good actor, and and he was a bit, he's complicated as a man, and he was working with an actress who had never done a drama really, and she was very prepared. And of course, Dad was very good with actors. I actually, in the book, I write about going to the set. And this is not going to be as precise to your point, Andrew, but it relates to it. And I was in college at Occidental, and I went over before lunch to watch them shoot in the morning. And they were doing a new scene, and Dad always liked to give the actors room. So he had the crew back up, and he just talked to the actors, and then he said to Monty, why don't you go in and just find a place there at the pool table, and then Elizabeth, you look for a place where you're comfortable. And so they worked on the scene, and they ran through it with the script clerk there to give them cues if they were having trouble with their lines. It took a while, and they finished, and Dad said, all right. He said, good. He said, let's do it again. And so they went and they did it, and he said, all right. He said, that's good. So, let's just do it again. And so they went and they did it, and then afterwards, Monty came over and he said, George, very intense. He said, and I forget what the question was. I wasn't in total earshot. And Dad started talking, and then Elizabeth came up, and and so then they talked, and even in that morning they worked out the scene, and were ready to shoot it after lunch, and they let the camera crew go to work, and we were talking, and I was talking with Dad, and I said, uh, why did you have him do it 3 times before you started to talk to him about um, how to do the scene? And he said, well, sometimes it's good to let the actors understand they need some help. That's just one way of working with actors. And he was very protective, that he didn't like loud sounds. He played music on the set. Um, and later, the Place in the Sun music he used on all his movies. Just when there was a romantic scene or a quiet scene, he'd play that beautiful theme.
Yeah.
And does it affect you, Ariana? That theme music.
It does.
You know,
It does.
you,
It takes you
you feel
into what's happening.
on the Diary of Anne Frank. I remember, often, he would just play it, and it's like a pitch pipe, and all the actors would begin to feel their own emotions, and they're quiet, and he would never, sometimes people would get ready and they okay, and the assistant director would yell out quiet, or ring a loud bell. And Dad never wanted that. He didn't want to get them all in this very tuned to themselves and their scene, and then have a loud bell ring or somebody holler. Or he would always, and then he just signal to Bill Meller to roll the camera, and he'd say, "All right, action," you know. And, but again, Ariana, that's the things people learn. I don't know where he learned it. He grew up on the stage, watching his parents act. And I just tell you a brief story. We'll come back to A Place in the Sun.
Okay.
But when he was a boy, his father played 500 different roles on the stage. Wow. Shakespeare, Dickens, the contemporary plays of the early 1900s. And they didn't have money for a babysitter, so that Dad and his brother would be there from the time they were little boys all up to teenagers. But he remembered that he used to like to do his homework under the stage when he was little. And the play he liked the most was Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, in which his father played Sidney Carton. And I found a tape of Dad being interviewed, I think it was possibly by Kevin Brownlow. And he talked about that experience. And he said, I would sit under the stage and do my homework, and they're doing A Tale of Two Cities, and I'd wait for the end. He said, and then I'd put away my homework, and I'd hear my father on the stage, hear his footsteps climbing the steps to the guillotine. And then I just could feel the audience get quiet. And then I'd hear him say, it's a far, far better thing I do than I have done before. It's a far better place I go to than I have. And then you hear the sound of the guillotine come down with this tremendous crack. And you could feel the audience breathless, and then you hear the curtain unfurl and the board hit the bottom, and then there's a pause, and then the curtain goes up for the curtain call, and then you hear the audience applaud. So you realize that here was a child hearing beautifully performed works, like listening to good music. So he had been around the theater, and he had this instinct with actors. Back to A Place in the Sun.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like, I think this is kind of a given on any film set, is that actors need to feel safe behind the camera. Mm-hmm. They gotta be able to be expressive in themselves and just be a part of whatever's going on. And I do think that it's more so, it's a team effort, but it's so important for the director to kind of play parent and make that safe zone for them. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like, that's such a wonderful thing. It's like, let them realize that maybe they need help. Mm-hmm. I mean, such a natural and peaceful and patient way to interact with actors. It definitely, you know, feels instinctual.
The other aspect of it is that you find out the actors have been thinking about this for 3 days or 6 weeks or 6 months, and you want to know what they, you know, you want what they have inside of them. So the things, it gives him a chance to see what they do, and the second time they try it and do it a little differently, and so you're learning. You're not going to miss, because some directors come in and they say, oh, so in this scene, you're in the chair over there, you're in the sofa, and you come in the door, and it's all, it's restricted, and you want to give the actors some breathing room to give you something you hadn't thought of.
And so that was kind of the secret, was that he made them to why he's a great actor's director, is that he made them comfortable, and also collaborated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Back to A Place in the Sun. Incredible cinematography. Beautiful. I believe you noted in one of the documentaries on the Blu-ray, which is on Amazon, by the way, is that for Montgomery Cliff scene with Elizabeth Taylor, it varies between bright and lush to dark and moody, such as when he's with Shelley Winters. Do you know how your father collaborated with William Mellor, the cinematographer?
I do know. At first, it's important to know that Captain William Mellor was in Dad's, in what became the Special Coverage Unit. It was called officially the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, but they became known as the Stevens Irregulars. And Bill Mellor was already had a good career in Hollywood, but he went in to serve and was a combat cameraman during the war, and Dad and Bill were very close. And so he asked him after the war to film A Place in the Sun. And my father was one of the few directors of that era who started out as a cameraman. So he brought, a point of view, and he just worked together with Bill Mellor, and Bill and encouraged him to be daring, with the light, because he wanted a lot of it to be, shot with some darkness. He didn't want it to be many of the scenes, he didn't want them to be bright and, and cheerful. And other than that, they spoke the same language, so, and he respected Bill's imagination and his confidence in getting the lighting right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it shows.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful film.
I think Mellor won the Oscar for it, yes.
Was there a moment you realized that Place in the Sun was a movie that would be remembered? Was it when you read the Mike Nichols interview? Was it when...
Well, no, I read the Mike Nichols interview very recently.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it came out, and it was, you got these amazing reviews, and
Right.
he won the Oscar and all of that. There was no doubt once it came out.
Huge success.
And then how would it stand the test of time? We keep learning more about that as years go by.
Did you have anything more to say about Place in the Sun, Mr. Stevens?
Well, I think we've taken a good bite out of the apple, as it were. It had a wonderful musical score.
Yes.
I think I was about to say to you that my experience when I was discovering how good a film it was really a pivotal experience in my life. While I was at Occidental, I would take time and go over to Paramount while Dad was editing the film, which he spent a year, as was his custom. by that time. Um, and Arianna, as you're probably aware, they used to have what were called moviolas, where editors edited films.
Oh yeah.
And it had a little screen about this big at the top. Yeah. And the director would stand over his shoulder and, uh, they'd say, okay, take this and that. And Dad never felt that, although he'd made a lot of pictures that way, for A Place in the Sun, he built a theater at Paramount in the Liberty Films building. Um, and it had maybe about 10 seats, but the screen filled the fourth wall. I mean, it was, the image was up there big, like uh, great, the great theaters today do. And there were two projectors. The projectionist worked all through the picture. And on either side of his chair, he had a control. And on one side, he had the control to run the right projection machine. And in the other, he had control to run the left projection machine. So he would put, say the scene on the lake where Shelley Winters drowns. Say he has that scene up on the right projector, and we run it, and so you're seeing it on the screen. You think about it. Then he wants to look for on the other reel. He would have, say they're in the boat. He would have all of Monty's close-ups, and all the takes of Monty's close-ups, all the different sizes. So when you're looking for the scene when Montgomery, where we feel he's changing his mind, that he is not going to drown her, but we think he's going to. He can run those, and on the big screen, he can see the perfect moment in Monty's eyes where that is communicated. And the same with Shelley, or in the love scenes, or any scenes, that he was able to view this thing of a size that the audience is going to see it, and make choices.
Yes.
And so I learned so much in my time going over there and spending an afternoon or a Saturday. So the editing was, as you look at it, you can realize how carefully put together it is, and creatively.
Oh yeah.
It was made for the big screen, and that's why he projected it on the big screen.
Right.
It was unusual at the time,
Yes,
as you noted.
it was. Yeah.
I'm sorry, you said it took him a year to edit this film?
Well, just about. Yeah.
That apparently, if I'm not mistaken, that was unusual for the time because the studio system was in effect. And for example, John Ford, director of many westerns such as The Searchers, just to name one of a couple dozen, he literally just for our listeners, I know you know this, Mr. Stevens, but he would cover up the camera lens when he was done with a shot and say, "All right, that's enough." And then they would just cut off the slates, and he would cut in camera, so that all they had to do was cut off the ends of the film, and then you would have the film. So to take a year to edit, what motivated your father to say, "Okay, I'm really going to craft this"? Was it that he kept in mind the test of time, and how did he get the power to do that?
Well, his entire career was working to have control of his films. In other words, he didn't want the studio wanting a different ending. He had control of his films. There was the issue of the time. Maybe it wasn't an entire year of A Place in the Sun, but it was. He shoots a great deal of film, and then how do you organize it into something that really works? I spent a great deal of time with him on the editing of Shane and of Giant, so I've seen this process. And Joe Mankiewicz, I quote him in my book, that he said George was really unlike any other directors I knew at the time. He would accumulate all of this film and then he would make his movie in the editing room. And even interestingly, in A Place in the Sun, the story changed in the editing room. That after Alice Tripp, the Shelley Winters character, drowns, and then Monty's gone trial. There was a big trial scene, and they realized that that was not what was needed, and so the trial scene became a very different kind of thing in the editing room, much shorter and doing only what was needed. It did not become a big suspense thing of whether he was going to be convicted or not be convicted. It became more revealing of his character and his own doubts about the situation. The wonderful scene at the end, you recall, where the priest comes to see him in the jail, and Monty says something to the effect that he's confused. He's not sure. And he said, "George, what were you thinking of when you were in the boat with Alice?" And you hear the Elizabeth Taylor theme music. And Monty says, and I don't know if he even answers the question. And he said, but he realizes that he's guilty of something, you know.
So you just talked about sound.
Yeah.
Sound was very important to your father, it seems like, in
Right.
his films. So that seems almost something that was started by Orson Welles in terms of Citizen Kane, in terms of adapting, like bringing sound into an expressionistic way to films such as in Citizen Kane, and it seems like your father took that kind of same mentality and ran with it. Am I wrong? Or am I wrong?
No, I think Orson, magnificent use of sound in Citizen Kane. I think, there was others were doing it, maybe not so outwardly,
Right.
but it is crucial. And A Place in the Sun, the sound, the factory whistle going off after Monty. Clift has been with Shelley Winters on that night, and the Arianna, the complexity of telling that story, and one reason Paramount didn't want to make it, and that had to persuade them to make it, was that the difficulty of treating this unwanted pregnancy, and in the scene where Shelley comes to see the old doctor, and she's not quite saying explicitly what she wants, but she wants an abortion.
Yeah.
And then he's very nice, and he's doing some other things while she's talking, and then he just was not. She says, "Well, you be this and that, you'll be all right." No, and she said that her husband didn't have a job or something she needed.
Yeah.
Then he's going, and finally, just out of frustration, she says to him, "I'm not married." And he drops an instrument on the counter, and it's, the subtleties of sound. So there are wonderful examples in that picture.
Oh yeah. Yeah, they do some of the expressing for the actors, which as they should. That's how it really is. You don't always have to say what's happening to express what's going on in someone's mind, and that was very clear.
So I have something that just occurred to me. Actually, it's a page from my manuscript that might be because we all kind of take A Place in the Sun is here, and we're happy for it. And uh, when Frank Capra and William Wyler and my father sold Liberty Films to Paramount because they really weren't able to make it work in time for a lot of reasons. And they each had to make a number of pictures for Paramount. That was part of the deal. And Dad had been there a year, and they kept not approving. He had final cut, but they wouldn't green light, as we come to say, pictures. And he wanted to make Dreiser's An American Tragedy, and they were reluctant. And he eventually got a brilliant criminal attorney from San Francisco, Vincent Hallinan, because he felt that the Hollywood lawyers were all a little bit beholden to the studios. And he wanted them to know he had somebody they weren't going to be able to mess around with. And so he laid it on the line to Paramount. And he said, "I will stake my professional reputation, which I have been called to do many times, on my judgment of this property, A Place in the Sun." And the gulf between filmmaker and management was evident in Paramount chief Henry Ginsberg's response. Quote his letter. "We refuse to admit that your judgment is better than that of our entire production organization, our sales department, and our New York home office executives combined. We had expected that you would be most appreciative of the time and effort expended, not only by me, but by everyone, including Paramount President, Mr. Balaban, in studying the advisability of proceeding with this story. And therefore, you can well imagine our surprise and our chagrin when, instead of being grateful, you seemed resentful because we rejected this story." That's the studio mentality. Right. How authoritative, how convinced they are that this would not be a worthwhile movie. Right. And it's certainly, if not the best, one of the three best movies these guys produced in their long careers.
Right.
So good things don't always come easy.
No.
No, not at all. I'm so glad that they fought for it. This is a wonderful story.
Yes. Sorry, just a moment.
We all got the the coughs.
Andrew needs his vodka to keep these things going.
Oh no. It's a little early for me. I could keep you around for hours, but I just want to say I'm so pleased to have you on the program. I hope you'll come back, and unless you have anything more to add, I just want to thank you so much for your time.
Well, wonderful, and I've really enjoyed being with you, Arianna, and Andrew, and I'm glad you found some of it interesting.
So much of it. So much of it. Yeah. I'm with Andrew. Thank you so much for your time to come and prioritize sharing with us, some of your knowledge. If there's no way for me to know what it was like to make films back then, or what it took to create such a film like this, and me and Andrew in the process of being, stretching our creative muscles, any chance to learn from someone like you is greatly treasured, and I'm so grateful that you're willing to come and chat with us.
Thank you, Ari.
Listeners, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for future episodes, please shoot us an email at independentcareerstudios@gmail.com. If you like this episode, please write a review and follow us on iTunes, SoundCloud, or YouTube. We'd love to hear your feedback. Behind the Flicks was created by myself and Arianna. I edited this episode. My name is Aaron Gentile. This has been an Independent Career Studios production.